would you like to be able to turn fruits and vegetable scraps from your kitchen into this, finished compost? It's really simple to do, and it's done with a process called worm composting or vermicomposting, the process of using worms to do your composting for you. Worm composting is very simple to do. All you need is the worm bin, the worms, the fruits and vegetable scraps, and some bedding for your worms to live in. You can buy worm bins at gardening stores or online, or you can make your own from simple things that you can find around any store or even around your house. These worm bins are constructed using plastic storage containers. All we've done is poke holes in the top and the bottom so that the worms can breathe, and then we filled it with the worm bin materials. The worms that you're going to be using are not the typical worms that you can dig up from your backyard. The worms are called red wigglers, and you can get them from some bait and tackle shops or from worm farms, but probably the easiest way to get it is from somebody who already has a composting bin. Once your compost bin starts going, you're going to have a lot of extra worms, and you can easily grab a handful out and give it to your friend for them to start their worm bin. Now these are special worms that live off a diet of fruits and vegetables, and so these guys are going to be very happy to eat any sort of thing that comes out of your kitchen. When you're prepping your worm bin, make sure that you've drilled a lot of holes in the top and maybe along the top of the sides of the bin so the worms can get plenty of oxygen. Another thing to consider is if you're using a plastic bin such as this, is if you want holes at the bottom of the bin as well. It's up to you, you don't need holes at the bottom, but there's some things to consider. First of all, there's going to be a lot of moisture in these bins as the worms compost. If you don't want it to get too wet and soggy in there, it's nice to have holes at the bottom of the bin as well so that the extra moisture can leak through. However, if you're planning on having your bins indoors, you probably wouldn't want all that extra moisture leaking onto your floor. So you can do a couple of different things. If you're buying the plastic storage bins, buy an extra one. That way, if you have the holes at the bottom of the bin, you can just double stack the bins, one inside the other, so that it actually will collect the drippings from the bin. Those drippings are actually really great to put on your plants that contain lots of nutrients, and it's like a liquid fertilizer. So that way you can have the moisture not stay in the bin, but you can still harvest it at the end and use it as a fertilizer. Once you have your worm bin, you can start filling it with the materials that you need to start composting. First of all, you're going to need some bedding material for your worms to live in. I like to use shredded newspaper because we have a lot of that lying around. You could also just use regular shredded paper or even something like dried leaves or manure for the worms to live in. When you add the material, make sure that it's sort of shredded up a little bit and that it's damp because worms like a damp environment. From time to time, you may find you need to add more bedding to your bin because the worms have eaten most of it. It's important to make sure that you have several inches of fresh bedding on your bin at all times at the top to protect the worms from the heat and to provide them with a nice spot to live. The worms are going to be living at the very top of the bin for the most part. If you're using shredded newspaper like I am here, make sure that the shreddings are fairly small but also very moist, because if you're adding dry material to the top of the bin, it will help to dry out the rest of the bin and could actually kill your worms. Once you've got your bedding in your bin, you can start feeding your worms. Now the worms can eat any sort of fruits or vegetables or even breads and cereals. The one thing to make sure that you do not feed them is any meats or dairy. Consider your worms to be vegans. So any leftover salad is fine. You can feed them as long as it doesn't have salad dressing. They don't like oils and fats. If you can chop the stuff up into smaller pieces, that's better. It's easier for a worm to eat a lemon if it's cut into wedges versus trying to get through that thick lemon whole. When you're adding things to your bin, make sure that you're not adding too much acidic stuff. For example, worms love coffee grounds. I don't know if it's just the small shape or the caffeine in them, but they love coffee grounds. But try not to add too many coffee grounds and too many coffee filters to your worm bin because of the acidity. The acidity can damage your worms. Small amounts are fine, but don't go too much on the coffee. When you're adding materials to your worm bin, make sure that you bury it inside. In other words, don't leave the material on the top of the bin because it's more susceptible to fruit flies that way. Always make sure that you pull back the newspaper and then bury the fruits and vegetables inside and then cover it back up with the newspaper. Other animals besides your worms may start to live in your compost bin. It's quite common to find fruit flies, soldier flies, and other tiny little organisms living with the worms. I wouldn't worry about it. It's usually fine. The worms don't mind. However, if you want to make sure that you don't have any other organisms in here, always cover all of your fruits and vegetables with several inches of bedding first. If you're using newspaper bedding like I am, make sure that you cover it with several inches of fresh and moist newspaper bedding. If you're having this indoors for a long period of time, I would also add several sheets of thick newspaper on the top to make sure that any flies don't get down into your bin. The worms do require certain temperatures in order to compost happily. They like to be between 60 and 85 degrees. Now, if it gets too hot, your worms can actually fry and die inside your worm bin. If it's too cold, they can freeze. So it's important to monitor where you place your compost bin. Some people are happy enough to have their worm bin underneath their kitchen sink in their house. A good kept worm bin will not smell very much, and so it's actually not that much of a sort of stinky thing to have in your house. I prefer to have mine outside just as there's more space. If you're putting your worm bin outside, make sure that it's in the shade so that the worms don't get too hot and die. On the other hand, in the wintertime, you might want to put your worm bin closer to the house or in the garage so that it doesn't get too cold. When you're thinking about what kind of worm bin to get, you might want to consider where you're going to be placing it. If you're making a big box that you plan on sitting in one spot, make sure that the box is in a location where it's not going to be too hot or too cold. For bins such as these, they're easily portable, so it doesn't really matter where you place the bin because you can always move it to a new location. For example, in the summertime, putting it underneath a tree where it's always shady. In the wintertime, putting it in the garage. To make it easier for you to harvest your worm bin, it's best if you feed on one side at a time. So I've just put all the material in this side. The next time I go to add some more fruits and vegetables, I might want to add it to this side. That way, when I need to add more material and I go back to this side again, this stuff should be pretty well composted while the worms are over here working on this. That'll make it easier for you to harvest your compost from your bin after you've got enough of it there, because the worms will be more on one side than the other, and one side will have decayed stuff while the other side will have fresh material. So here, under several layers of shredded newspaper, you can see the fruits and vegetables that the worms have started to eat. There's mostly just peels left. So these guys are probably ready to be fed again. They're very selective about what they eat. Potato peels, they'll eat the potato and leave the actual peel themselves. They'll leave seeds usually. You can see some pumpkin seeds in here. But they'll eat the rest of the material. So all the brown stuff that you see is actually the worm compost itself. And even in here, there's some worm eggs. This little one right here. Gosh, where did it go? Here we go. There's a worm egg right there. And out of that, actually it's a cocoon. Hundreds of baby worms will be crawling out eventually. So this is a sign that these worms are very happy because they're reproducing. Worms reproduce the best when it's warm, when it's around in the 80s. If it's really cold outside, they're not going to be reproducing very much. And they won't be eating very much either. So if you can keep your worm bin warmer, you'll be able to have more composting happening. How much material should you be feeding your worms? Well, your worms will pretty much let you know. The easiest way to do it is to keep a bucket underneath your sink where you can throw all of your fruits and vegetable trimmings as you produce them. Maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks, or whenever your bucket is full, you can bring it out to your worm bins to feed them. Now, if you feed your worms like we showed, moving away the newspaper, putting the food in there and covering it up, and then you come back in 2 weeks and all the material is still there, you're probably feeding your worms too much. If you, every time you look and all the material is gone, maybe your worms can be eating a little bit more. Your worms will kind of let you know if they need more food or less food based on whether it's there or not. How many bins do you need for your family? You'll notice that too as you start to feed your worms. If you notice that there's always lots of fresh fruits and vegetables in here and it's not being eaten fast enough, you might need to start another bin. Just get another bin, prep it like we showed with the newspaper and the holes. Grab a handful of worms from your old bin and throw it into the new bin, and you can start a whole new bin that way. Once your bin starts to look like this, it's time to harvest your worm compost. Here you can see all the brown stuff are on the outside of the bin, and all of this brown stuff in here is actually finished compost. You can still see some shredded newspaper left, and if you dig inside, there will be some fruits and vegetable scraps left, but for the most part, this is just worm compost. Now the worms are still living in here, so you can't just grab a handful of this stuff and throw it in your garden. You're going to be losing all of your worms. So you'll need to find a way to separate the worms from the compost. Fortunately, there's a really easy way to do that. The worms hate sunlight, so in order to separate the worms from the compost, simply make a pile of the compost on a table in the sun. The worms will actually migrate to the bottom of the pile, and you can scoop off all the compost at the top without getting any of your worms. Here you can see they're all at the bottom here. So after you've sorted out your worms from your compost, be sure to throw the worms back in the bin so they can continue the composting. Once you've got all this finished compost, it's probably not a good idea to throw this stuff directly on your plants. You're going to want to lay it out flat in the sun to dry to kill any other diseases, bacteria that might be still in here, and also to make sure that you don't have any little bits of fruits and vegetables that haven't quite decomposed. You can throw those back in the worm bin too, and then spread this on your plants. And that's it. Worm composting is easy, it's simple, and you can do it just in a regular plastic bin in your garage.